Fantastic. It looks like we are live. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Hey, Brad. Hey, Will. So glad to have you both on.
Glad to be here.
As we wait for folks to join over the next minute or two, I'd love to know where everyone is tuning in from today. So for our audience, drop it in the chat. I am in Washington, D.C. Will's in Texas. We've got San Francisco, Kansas City, Virginia, Central Arkansas, Vancouver, Phoenix, Bangalore, India. That's fantastic. We've got Austin, Sacramento, people from all over. The beach in Florida, I'm very jealous of that. All right, well, thanks everyone. Looks like we've got a good group with us today. So we can kick things off. Hi, I'm Claire McKenna. I'm our Director of Corporate Marketing here at C1, formerly Conductor One. And today we're talking about something that every security and GRC leader is dealing with right now. AI adoption is accelerating, it's coming from the top, and it's outpacing most likely the governance programs that companies have previously built. So I'm joined today by two people who have two very different vantage points to what's happening right now. So we have Brad, the CEO of BARR Advisory. Brad, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Looking forward to sharing our expertise. I'll be sharing more from the auditor perspective. So our firm does both advisory and audit services, and there's a lot of great client stories that I'm looking forward to sharing with you all. And I appreciate any questions that come through the chat.
Awesome. Thank you, Brad. Really glad to have you here. And then Will Bengtson is our CISO here at C1. Will, I'll pass it to you to intro yourself.
Yeah, hey everyone, Will Bengtson, CISO here at C1. Been here about 4 months now. Giving you the practitioner side of the ball today, and super excited to be chatting with Brad, and they've been helping us in the past, so super stoked to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Will. So between the three of us, we're going to cover what's actually changed about AI governance, what auditors are looking for, what practitioners need to be thinking about and building, and what you can do this quarter to start closing the gap. So let's get into it just to kick things off. I think the directive everyone is hearing from their boards, from the C-suite right now, is to adopt AI and show ROI to the board. But for security and GRC teams, that raises a harder question. How are you governing something that moves this fast? So just to kick things off, Brad and Will, I'd love to hear about just the single biggest thing that you've seen change with governance in the last 6 months from where you stand. And Brad, I'll kick it to you first.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm going to answer from two different perspectives. One on the business side. I think the models have gotten a lot better over the past 6 months, and I think also the businesses have gotten better. We're seeing a lot of our clients have get out of pilot purgatory, where they're actually creating a roadmap, a business strategy to think about these different types of things. And so with that said, what that has done is we've seen a lot of change over the past 6 months with our clients, is moving from AI as more of an advisor, as an output, to more actions. So making decisions on behalf of their specific workflows, which I think is great. And then I think from a regulatory standpoint, that's a different perspective. So for the GRC folks, it's all the different shakeup of laws, and you've got the Colorado law that went into effect. You've got the EU AI Act that I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later, and then of course the executive order that came out trying to deregulate everything. So there's lots of different signals and noise out there that I'm looking forward to talking more about today. Specifically with the EU Act, that with that change recently that came out in May. Don't let the headline fool you. While it did push out some of the enforcement on the high risk Annex A systems, that doesn't mean that there's still enforcement coming in August. So all that to say, there's been a lot of great regulatory change, I think, that helps give guidance. But I think the most important change has been businesses are putting more of a business strategy around their AI versus a bunch of pilots.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And Will, what about you? What's kind of been the single biggest governance change you've seen in the past 6 months?
Yeah, similar to what Brad was saying. Yeah, I think it was just 6 months ago that the models got to a place where people were really excited and actually seeing that, okay, this AI thing's here and it's working. So I think what's changed is people are having the conversation. Some companies are doing it such that they're like really cranking up governance and they're saying no AI. Some companies are cranking it down and they're saying everyone use AI. Let's just move as fast as possible. And then ideally people are finding that balance of where do we enable employees with the right level of governance to make sure that we're doing the right things as a business. I will say the one thing I have found that I haven't seen in a long while is that if a business is not enabling folks to use AI the right way internally through some governed path, people are figuring out how to do it around the governance path. And so people are using AI whether you like it or not, which I think is both good and bad. It's showing how promising it is, but from a risk perspective for the business, I can see how that could be pretty bad as well. I think the biggest one is people are understanding it's here, it's staying, they're figuring out the governance path, be it whether they're turning that dial all the way to the right or somewhere in the middle or all the way to the left. But I will say, like, the conversations are finally happening. I still think back to like when GPT first dropped. I was one that was like, I hope this dies like the blockchain. Like, and fast forward to today, it's like this is amazing. Like what, and I can't wait to see where it is in 6 months.
Definitely. Diving back a little bit to what Brad was saying, what you mentioned, how companies are starting to really have roadmaps that tracks with what we've seen in our research. Research conducted at C1 in our Future of Identity report, we found that actually 95% of the organizations we surveyed have agents performing tasks autonomously. And then on the other hand, we're having these conversations with security leaders telling a little bit of a different story, not because they think AI is bad, but because the technology is moving a lot faster than their ability to govern it. So Brad, when your clients come to you with maybe a gap in adoption and governance, maybe they don't even know what they don't know, what does that look like? And what are you seeing from them?
Well, I think it's good to anchor on some patterns that we've seen over history too, is that there's really not a whole lot of difference in, when the cloud and mobile technology was trying to come out. There's different risks, of course, but has the governance ever really kept up with the change? I think the answer is no. And what I think is fundamental always is getting to the basics of having the right terminology of how you can communicate with your stakeholders. And so I had a client come to me with that same question the other day of, just an example of, we set an acceptable use policy for how we want to direct our employees and contractors, et cetera, for how to use AI. And we didn't have Claude on that list. So like they were prescriptive in the types of systems and applications that they wanted to do. And so now they're asking for Claude. What do we do? And my first question was, well, do you have a third-party risk management policy, right? And it's the same. I think sometimes it's easy to get lost in AI without realizing the basics that most companies have a governing program. Test it, and so stress test it against this. That doesn't mean it's perfect, but go through your third-party risk management process. Make sure you understand the workflows is the second question. And if you have that governing framework to go back to your existing governing program, I think that's important to get into the basics, because every company most likely has some governance around something. If they don't, then it's a good opportunity to start from scratch. But I think the biggest gap is just making sure they're getting back to the basics of their existing program, and that starts with how you're evaluating risk, how you're looking at your impact outside, kind of that outward mindset to others, and then unfortunately, this is probably said too many times, is inventory and making sure you realize what all is out there. But I think the good thing that, to Will's point, I think people are eager, unlike back in the cloud and mobile days where I think that was really coming bottom up. From the standpoint of there's a lot more shadow IT happening back then. I think what is really good now is I've seen a lot more cultures embrace this and really wanting to drive good conversations, which has been great.
Yeah, absolutely. That's amazing to see. And then Will, I love, you kind of alluded to this earlier. You have seen a couple organizations default to saying no to AI. And here at C1, I know we have an approach of really embracing and enabling AI rather than locking things down. And that's something that you've really driven as our CISO here. But what do you think happens when organizations just default to no when people ask about using AI tooling?
Yeah, I think I alluded to a little bit earlier with, people are going to figure out how to use it regardless. And so you're going to potentially fall outside of commits with customers or businesses or whatever you might be of, what you're saying and how your software is being produced or whatever the service you're providing is. So I think people are going to be scrappy and either figure it out or not. I hate to say it. I think today things are moving so much faster than they have. And there's going to be a lot of companies that just become irrelevant or get surpassed by the second, third place, if they don't really turn to embrace, because others are just able to do things. You're able to see a feature that your competitor launched and say, hey, I can go do that too. And what used to take you 6 months to 12 months might take you, 3 weeks. And so I really do think if you aren't embracing AI and figuring out how to leverage it, you're going to fall behind, which is going to be super interesting to see what companies I think we're going to be able to see which companies have embraced AI over the next 6 months based on where are they positioned in the market and how they're doing as a business as well. And I think AI is really just, in some cases, taken a lot of businesses out of I know we think about things here internally of do we need to go buy this or can we build it? What model is best for engineering versus general purpose versus the sale, and so we've got to kind of think about it all across the board. But yeah, I truly think if you aren't saying yes to AI, people are using it whether you want to or not. And then, that would be a broad question. How bad could that be? Or, maybe it's more a legal question than of anything of okay, we say that we're not using AI to write software, but it turns out, I've been using my personal Claude Pro account and writing software, but just committing it as myself, right? Not as the bots.
Right. Okay, so we've established things have pretty much fundamentally changed over the past 6 months, and the instinct to shut it down just does not work. So let's talk about what that means kind of for GRC and audit specifically. One question that we hear a lot, and we've been talking a lot, is kind of this human in the loop versus speed. So is human in the loop actually a requirement for compliance in 2026, or can teams build automated guardrails that are going to satisfy an auditor without slowing down an agent? Brad, as the auditor perspective, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, my point of view is no, human in the loop is not a requirement.
Okay.
The requirement is how have you thought through the risks that are in place and what kind of then guardrails after that. So, what does that mean? I think a question that helps get teams really, or clients to really think through this risk in a little bit more tangible way is, can this agent do something that cannot be undone?
Right.
And so if the answer is yes, it can do something that cannot be undone, whatever that might be, business process, approval of invoice, whatever that might be, then it means it's a higher risk. And then you got to start looking at, what's the impact of that? What's the blast radius of how many things can be undone? Because typically it's, when you start to get agents involved, it just amplifies the impact. And so typically from the beginning, that would mean that is a good candidate for having some human in the loop. But better yet, then we can get into more of this specifics of what we like to look for. That's a little bit different than typical logging is then, okay, can we then put another agent on top of that starts to look at different judgment and kind of that judgment agent as well. And so, but often you need that human in the loop to begin with, kind of like typical what you want to see in like red team exercises. You want to start to get some human in the loop to start seeing some of those edge cases, to let that process mature a little bit, so that you can give good direction to a future, agent that would give more judgment. So, I mean, the short answer is no. There's no requirement that it's got to be human in the loop. But the fundamental requirements are always there. That you're always going to get asked, have you thought through the risk? And what we're really trying to get down to is what's your line of thinking when it comes to not only your risk to yourselves, but also the impact outside. And that's a very big emphasis with 42001, ISO 42001, is not only your internal risk, but your impact. They say society. I mean, that's a broad thing, but start with your key stakeholders and interested parties. And that to me is more fundamental with AI, because the old way of, I shouldn't say old way, a traditional way of auditing is more point in time.
Mm-hmm.
Back of what you've done in the past, seeing the outcomes. But things they're much more real time now. And so I'm more interested, and we spend a lot more time up front with our clients on their line of thought around their values, their risk, how they think about risk, because that's the process that all this stuff goes through, more so than being able to go back and audit an output, because the output might be wrong, because the intent, maybe there was some intent there that was really missing. And that's what we're looking at when we think about human in the loop, and the things that we try to see is how it ties back to those risk assessments.
That makes a lot of sense, and is a good bridge to the next question, because I did want to dive a little bit deeper on kind of what needs to be logged. So like standard logs might show what happened. Okay, an agent accessed the system, pulled this data, took this action. But like you mentioned, auditors want more than that. They want to know why it happened, the reasoning, the context. So when you're thinking about an audit trail, what does that even look like for companies that are running AI in production?
Yeah, let's start with access. I mean, just in general, I mean, because this access management has been the challenge from the beginning of time, of just how you manage access. And from an access standpoint, what we first try to make sure that the company's clear on is that they're not just being lazy with access and giving broad access to everything. And so, 20 years ago there was just an excessive amount of service accounts. Well, that's no really different than how we think about these, identities from agents. Is then, okay, we can't give them excessive access, because that means that they can go, it's a lot more easier to go rogue. And so first we start out with the governance around how they manage access. So that's what we look for first.
Right.
Then when it comes to logging, then we get into more runtime and observability. And so I'll just use an example of an invoice. This isn't exactly a security example, but it relates, because you could have an agent that is approving invoices for payment. If you just give that agent, if you just are looking at the log, you see that they had access to something and that there was an output of an approval. But sometimes there's sequences that you want to make sure you're running through. And if you're giving that access to all their emails, there is a greater risk of going rogue with that, that it could see invoices and do something outside of the intent, because all these different instructions are really just configurations. These prompts are just configurations at the end of the day. And so what we want to see is a little bit more than just the log of what happened. We want to see what was the intent, what was the right decision there. Not necessarily for us to just audit that, but so that we can see that those mechanisms are set up so that if something does go wrong, that there's an easy way to go out and correct that, as an example.
That was a really helpful example. Thank you. And I love how you started out with access management. That's something we maybe know a thing or two about here at C1. So this is actually the perfect shift over to Will to talk a little bit about the practitioner strategy. So Will, obviously least privilege is always the goal. And in practice, that's really has been really difficult. And now we have agents that are moving kind of across multiple systems. And so how are you thinking about this for agents inheriting permissions? So at C1, agents are inheriting user level permissions. rather than standing on God mode access. Can you walk us through just why that matters?
Yeah, I think it's very important as part of the strategy of how you deploy agents, and kind of what is your first step towards adopting or really embracing AI. I think everyone is talking about like, oh, we'll give the agent is a service account, we'll give it all the permissions that you need or that it needs, and it can do all the things, right? And that may be a valid approach for someone, but maybe not valid for someone else. I think the most important thing, especially from a security perspective, is who is this agent? What is it doing? Who owns it? And I think there's a difference between like your personal assistant agent and like an agent acting as like, triaging your security ad inbox, for example. I think those are also very different scenarios where if I just have an agent that's telling me, hey, how does my day look? Don't forget about these things in Slack. Like obviously it doesn't need to have access to say production where I might normally have access. And so, the God mode permissions of that are not necessarily in scope there. I think ideally you want the agent to be you so that in the audit trail, it's showing that, hey, I did the things, but kind of the same way that you would approach least privilege in your day-to-day is kind of how I think about how my agent should approach day-to-day. Or do I have one agent that can do 20 different things, or do I have 20 different agents that each can do one specific thing? And then I can give that agent just those very specific permissions. So if one of them were to go rogue or be compromised, it's not as big of a risk, like Brad was saying. Things can be undone if something were to go wrong. And so, we kind of think about it here of, is there a mechanism where we can have an agent act with some level of baseline permission, and if it needs to do something else because its scope has expanded or it's given a task that it doesn't normally have permission to do, it has the ability to go request that access as well. Of like similarly to how I would do it. It's like, oh, I need to go operate in AWS now. Let me go get a permission or an access that I don't normally carry to go do the task. And then most importantly, when I'm done with that task, how do I drop off that access? And so, that's kind of the way that we've been thinking about things, especially when it comes to like personal assistants. The default thing, I think, when you're building applications, and I think a lot of things here in the new world is, and you can call it an agent or you can call it an application. Previously, we wrote an application to do a very specific thing. Today, we deploy an agent that has the ability to do the thing that our application could have done without us necessarily having to code every aspect of that, right? And
Right.
You wouldn't necessarily deploy me to production as the thing that's like onboarding and offboarding all users through the systems ideally. You'd want some sort of agent that has that permission that maybe represents as a member of the team. But I think in a lot of cases, people get lazy, and so you end up having agents having too many permissions, or they're like, okay, I can't get this to work. Let me just give it all the permissions in the world. It starts working, and then they forget to go back and like kind of rescope it. And so I think, for us, it's very much how do we try to right size it from the beginning, but also create these mechanisms through access requests or step up auth or something of those lines that the agent can get more permission to do what is needed and not just fail.
Yeah, I really like that, Will. And I think one thing that it also ties in a little bit with, there's one question in chat about we talk about agents a lot by them doing things and some of the guardrails that we can put in place. It's often forgotten too even adding on to what you mentioned, Will, is because there was a question in there that says, how can we assure on the agents that human in the loop can be skipped? And the agents are only as good as the data and the context that it's given. You wouldn't give somebody just hired on to the company in the first day on the job, say, good luck with that client interaction. There's similar to how you manage tasks and processes within your company. There's going to be a training area. And so we had a client off one time that they wanted to skip human in the loop. And so they treated it just like a new hire. And so they had a 90 180-day kind of waiting period where they had human in the loop to kind of coach. They're essentially coaching the agent on how to do its job, starting to catch different nuances that of decisions and just kind of coaching it back of here's what you should do in this situation. Oh, we didn't think about that situation. So you start to build that context and be very specific on what is the job that you have. Do you have a documented job responsibility, just like you would expect any human? And I think that's really important to not, it's like we start to lose sight of, we've run businesses in very similar ways in the past. We can't just think agents would be a whole lot different than our fundamental operating system that we run a business on.
Awesome. That was a really great answer. Super helpful to have that example too. I do want to, before we we have a lot more to dive into, but I did want to just ask, kind of talk a little bit about strategic alignment before tool adoption. So Brad, you made this point before, something I've heard you talk about a lot is that oftentimes tool adoption isn't actually linked to where the company strategically wants to go. There's no real silver bullet tooling. People are just adopting tools because they're available and maybe not because they're solving the problem they need them to. So when it comes to evaluating AI tools and use cases to greenlight versus which ones are just noise, how are you thinking about that?
I think it goes back to what the business strategy, and
Yeah.
it's about things to greenlight is in order for the tools to be successful, you can't even think of it just as that one tool. You got to think about, if we're doing AI transformation, it can't just be something that you're layering on top of existing tool sets. It's no longer really, I wouldn't say transformational to put on a chat bot and just put it over the top of your existing architecture and call it a day, because that's just a short-term strategy that really might look good from a metric standpoint. Oh, we're saving some time. But a story is, you might have heard the Zillow story from 2021 that has been out there for a while. They put in all this different types of tooling, but there was not a really clear business strategy in how they shared data across all these systems. So before you even get into tooling, you got to have the data foundation layer and tied to the business strategy, so that you can't even get to the tooling if they don't have good processing, good data to feed that. So then the question is, okay, how do you greenlight things? The way we've done it, the way we've seen it successful is, simple 4x4 quadrant, right? If it's high impact, high feasibility on the top right, that's something that is that you would start with first. If it's low impact, meaning from a business impact, and that can be done through interviews and all sorts of workshops, but that's something that you wouldn't want to do. You wouldn't want to greenlight something that's going to be more expensive than it's really worth. But if you don't have that foundational data and you don't have that foundational context with the business plan strategy, then it's not worth jumping into tooling. And that's not to say you can't experiment with some things to start to learn more, but you can't really start greenlighting that, in my opinion, before you link it back to those workflows and business plan.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Just going back to the business value first. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground. Let's bring it home with one or two more questions about what people need to be thinking about next. So looks like we got a question in the chat, but I think hopefully we can answer this. So as new frameworks like the EU AI Act and ISO 42001 are maturing, the compliance bar is really going up. So I'd love to hear from both of you, Will, what advice you might have for GRC teams and practitioners that are preparing for new audit frameworks, and then we'll pass it over to Brad for the same.
Yes, so first one is, go out and make sure you're aware of these things. If you aren't, be talking to your auditors and say, hey, what are the things that we should be aware of? If you're at a company that you're selling a product, get close to product to make sure you're understanding what other customers are asking for or inquiring about, to give you some sort of roadmap that you can work towards. In general, when it comes to adopting new models or thinking about that, I'd say you need to have some sort of process and policy in place. But I'd emphasize making sure that it's not too heavy-handed, because I would say, to not to pile on what I said before, but if it's going to take 3 to 6 months to approve, the new Opus model or some new frontier model, your teams are going to go figure out how to use it anyway, or you're going to really stifle the innovation and really slow down progress, which is ultimately going to hurt the business. And so I think back to kind of what Brad was alluding to with, you really have to figure out from a risk perspective what you're willing to say yes to or not to. And so I would look at it from that perspective. And I think if you really wanted to do some crazy time from a GRC perspective, let everyone use whatever model they want. At least to experiment and see which ones are the best. But I would say you probably want to work quickly towards here's what we use for what situations, and really kind of set that paved path internally so that you're not having to just try to keep up with, okay, what is sales using today? What is the next company using today? And I think the biggest thing that's get ready for any GRC team beyond internal use of AI is your teams are going to want to buy so much more because there's all these new things that are companies that have popped up, and it's going to enable them to move faster. And if they can't build it with AI themselves, they're going to go try to buy it. So I think you're going to have some pain one way or the other, whether you're figuring out how to use AI internally well, or whether you're figuring out how do I approve these new vendors because our sales teams or whoever wants to bring them in to help them do their job better.
Got it. Great answer. Brad, I'd love to pass it to you to kind of talk about how the compliance environment is changing, but and maybe you could answer this question we have in the chat from Mike. Are there anticipated new controls and revisions in accounting for AI in the AICPA, TSP, or other notable auditable frameworks?
Yeah, there's a lot of noise out there, and I think I'd always start with most of what the regulatory bodies and even standards bodies are doing is thinking about more companions to your existing control set. So I don't see the AI. I don't think SOC 2, in my opinion, is a great mechanism for auditing to AI. It can, but it doesn't have the prescriptiveness like other controls. But think of it this way: is that AI is an amplifier, and you got to get really good at the controls that are pretty basic. And so that would be things like I mentioned before, inventory, asset management, access management, risk management. I would really think about it as leveraging these other companions that have been pushed out, like CIS has pushed out just recently a great companion to their framework. There's then the AI, the NIST risk management framework that is great. Then you've got, of course, ISO 42001. Those are good companions. Those are management type systems that you can include within your existing control sets to think about the nuances that AI might bring. Like a common example, and I go back to risk management all the time because that's what we're really dealing with. When you're introducing these new layers or new emerging technology, it's just maybe there's a little bit different risk profile. So an example would be, instead of a traditional vulnerability scan or vulnerability management, you can't see the typical vulnerabilities within AI, like with things like a deputy confusing the deputy attack. That's when you're tricking the deputy agent into doing something different. That doesn't really show up in like a typical traditional vulnerability scan, but that's a risk that you need to consider. And so these companion guides, I think, in my opinion, are good inputs into your risk assessment so that you can think through that and put your thinking hat on as an organization. Because unfortunately, as we talked about earlier, these governance programs are not, they're not bleeding edge. The governance programs don't start first and then the tech comes. It's the tech comes and the governance follows. So that's why risk management is so important. These companion guides are fantastic. So I would encourage going out, looking at CIS. I would encourage looking at the NIST risk management framework and AI 42001 or ISO 42001, and then happy to talk about the EU AI Act as well, because they have some pretty good guidance as well.
Awesome. That's fantastic guidance. So thank you. All right, we're gonna close with one more question before we open it up to some Q&A from the audience. We do have a few questions that I know we want to get to, but simple and direct. If someone watching today has agents in production, you know their governance maybe isn't where it needs to be, what is the first thing they should do? Will, I'll have you start.
I'd say it depends on your knowledge of what's in production. So I think the first thing is visibility. Go figure out what you have, as that's going to be the first thing for you to figure out the next step in your game plan. And once you figure out what you have, you can figure out how big of a risk is it potentially, and that could change the course of action of like, shut this down now, or okay, this is fine, but we need to figure out how to oversight, auditability, whether it's you're going to have something where like, okay, every quarter, let's make sure and let's go enumerate all of our agents to see do we still need them, or what permissions do they have, are they still valid? Because I think that's something that, especially if agents are acting as humans, depending on how you think of it, do you bring them into control of like user access reviews? Is there an agent access review that you want to start doing in the future? Or are you truly treating an agent as an app like you would in the past? And then you should think about, okay, well, how do you manage app permissions? Which you might already have some governance modeled there from an infrastructure perspective. So I always say visibility is the most important thing. Once you have visibility, you can start putting some guardrails in place and or controls.
Yeah, I agree, and I mean, and document it as well. I mean, I can't tell you how often we run into. We do a lot of
practitioners. We always forget to document, Brad.
It's the hardest part, yeah, and it's like the afterthought. But man, we have this really cool thing called AI that can help you document nowadays, which is cool and neat. And I think it sounds so simple, and I know it's like the last thing on people's mind, but that goes back into the basics. Is how often I can't tell you how often we come into a client and like, oh, what's that account? What does that account do? Like, oh, that's the thing for AI. It's like, well, what does it do? Like, I don't know what it does. It does something. And so, but if you don't have any reference point to go and look at, it's hard to really. I mean, it's just like, oh, I don't have a job responsibility doc or something. I mean, this documentation becomes more important now, because we think about prompts sometimes. Now this language that we're putting into these systems now is like code, and because it's like code and configurable items, that's like reframing what a prompt is now. I mean, that is code, and so we've got to make sure we're documenting what these different things and business processes are doing. So yeah, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it's just that documentation is so fundamental.
Makes sense. Visibility and documentation. Don't forget that one, Will. All right. Would love to open up for questions in the audience. We have a few that I know we want to get to, but for anyone who joined, feel free to drop a question in the chat. We do have a good one here to start with that I got. So for smaller companies and startups in the audience, you're hearing all of this and maybe thinking, okay, we don't have a real security or GRC budget. So for both of you, whoever wants to take it first, what can early stage organizations do to take this on without really any budget or investment?
Gosh, Will, you want to take that first, or let me go?
I'll yield to the expert, and then I'll follow up.
Yeah, no budget for security. Let me think about that one. So it sounds, so let's go back to the governing thing. So that basically means you have no governance program. I would always advise smaller companies to not get overwhelmed with all the different frameworks out there, and just go with one and pick it and just start small from there. I mean, NIST has some great small business guides that you can start with. What I think small businesses get in that trap is the compliance trap, is meaning that they have kind of their mechanisms for showing compliance to an auditor. Like, just need to get SOC 2, so let me just do a quick, execution on SOC 2, and that might get you that report out the door relatively quickly. But The compliance is the table stake, and that's you can't have your destination be the compliance. Otherwise, you don't start building in that habit of that risk. What's most important is that risk management. I would much rather see a client that has done a really robust risk assessment that explained why they didn't have to do all these controls than one that did 200 controls. And so for me, having a really good risk assessment is the most important starting point. Just do that control, which is could be as simple as I'm a 2-person startup. I'm getting all my team together and just talking about what could go wrong if we introduce this new model or if we introduce this new agent. That is more powerful to me than trying to fit in your business with what you think is the intent of these controls. But all the frameworks, all the standards, they've moved to less prescriptiveness, which they do have guides on, but they've moved to less prescriptiveness and more focus on how you're evaluating risks. If you can build that muscle early, you're gonna have a better long-term success.
Great
I
answer.
think falling onto that, it's amazing what you can do now because of AI and how I wouldn't say how cheap, but how less expensive it can be to make some huge strides when it comes from a security program perspective. I think the most important thing you can do, what you kind of alluded to, if you have no budget but you still want to do something, is you've made that important step in the right direction of, yes, we're taking security seriously. And I would urge folks that I hope you're taking it because you want to do the right thing and not kind of like what Brad said, have a risk assessment and understand why you don't need to do certain things versus just going to do the controls. Like, I think the last thing from a security perspective I want to see is people just doing checkbox compliance. I did this because I had to kind of deal versus I did this because it's the right way to approach, the way we deploy or whatever that is. And so I would say, start small, figure out where you want to make some improvements. What is the right strategy? I would caution you, if you go ask AI for a security program roadmap, it's going to give you some super robust, really long thing that's going to be overwhelming. And so maybe if you're going to ask AI for some guidance, be super pointed in what you want to achieve and the outcome, and ask for some tangible steps that are concise and not overly arduous, if you will. But I would say leverage the AI as you're going through this, because that'll help you, especially if you have no budget. We have these conversations. Where do you use AI versus hiring, right? And so I think if you have no budget, there's obviously no budget to hire someone. So you got to be kind of scrappy and figure out, how to do it. And I think first step is kind of saying you're going to do it and make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. And then do that risk assessment, like Brad said, and then that'll help you point to where the places that we need to start focusing.
One of the most important laws, it's debatable, in cybersecurity occurred in 1914. It was the FTC put out the Federal Trade Commission Act. And I think it applies today, and actually was one of a groundbreaking law for a lot of future cases, like Microsoft, Lilly, a couple others got sued, and before all these frameworks came out, because of this law. And the basic premise of this law is that it prohibits unfair or deceptive acts or practices in offering e-commerce. And so I think that's an important mindset to think when you're going through these motions of trying to move fast. If you have a mindset that, is what I'm doing going to screw over my customer, or is it going to screw over my partner, or do something bad? And I know you can't make the mistake excuse anymore of, I don't know, I have the unknown unknown. You have so many free resources at your disposal, but if something doesn't feel right, it's worth kind of checking in and doing a quick sanity check on if it could be deceiving to the public.
Awesome answer. And that brings us right to time. So great questions. Thank you everyone who participated in the chat. Thank you all for joining today. If you want to dig any deeper into the data we referenced, the 2026 C1 Future of Identity Report is available on our site. And if you want to see how C1 approaches identity governance for AI, we'd love to show you. Similarly, I'm sure BARR would love if you have questions about your GRC program, please reach out to them. Brad, Will, thank you for a great conversation, and thank you everyone for joining. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you both.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Brad.